14 of Europe's most powerful CEOs, men and women who collectively control over 300 billion euros in assets, sitting in stunned silence. Their expensive Italian leather chairs suddenly feel uncomfortable. Their translators have gone quiet. Mid-sentence, though translation is no longer needed. Everyone in that room understands exactly what just happened. President Ibrahim Traoré had spoken for exactly 7 minutes and 23 seconds. No shouting, no threats, no dramatic gestures. Just 7 minutes of calm, measured words that would force these corporate titans to abandon operations they'd controlled for decades. Within 72 hours, 11 of these companies would flee. Burkina Faso entirely, leaving behind assets worth billions. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Traoré never told them to leave. He simply offered them a choice. And somehow, that choice terrified them more than any ultimatum ever could. To understand how 7 minutes changed everything, we need to rewind to that morning when these executives stepped off their private jets, confident they were about to attend just another routine meeting with another African leader they could easily manipulate. The European Business Council had requested this meeting weeks earlier. Their strategy was simple and time-tested. Pressure the young military leader into maintaining the sweetheart deals they'd enjoyed for over 60 years. After all, they reasoned, Burkina Faso desperately needed foreign investment. These companies provided jobs, brought technology, connected the country to global markets. Without them, the economy would collapse overnight. Marcus Richter, CEO of Titan Resources, embodied this arrogance perfectly. As his convoy of black SUVs rolled through Ouagadougou's dusty streets, he was already planning his evening flight to Paris. "This won't take long," he told his colleague with a dismissive chuckle. "These African leaders always cave when you show them the numbers." Henrik Anderson of Nord Gold Mining was equally confident. His company had been extracting gold from Burkina Faso's mines for 3 decades, paying workers less than 50 euros per month while shipping out millions in precious metals. The arrangement worked perfectly for shareholders in Stockholm. Why would anyone want to change it? Claudette Moreau represented 3 major French agricultural conglomerates that controlled 60% of Burkina Faso's fertile land. Her companies grew cotton for European fashion houses while local children suffered malnutrition. She saw nothing contradictory about this. Business was business, after all, but their first hint that something was different came when their vehicles stopped at an unexpected location. Instead of the presidential palace or a luxury hotel, they found themselves staring at a modest community center in one of Ouagadougou's working-class neighborhoods. "There must be some mistake," Moreau muttered, already reaching for her phone. Her assistant frantically made calls, but the message came back clear. This was the correct location. President Traoré was waiting inside. The confusion deepened as they approached the building. Through the windows, they could see this wasn't going to be a private negotiation behind closed doors. The room was packed with ordinary Burkinabe citizens, miners with calloused hands, farmers in traditional dress, teachers, nurses, elderly women, young people with smartphones ready to record everything. This violated every rule of how these meetings were supposed to work. Where was the pomp and ceremony? Where were the presidential guards and formal protocols they could navigate? Instead, they were walking into a room full of the very people whose labor had made their companies billions. At exactly 10 o'clock, Ibrahim Traoré entered the room. The contrast was jarring. While the executives wore expensive suits worth more than most Burkinabe earned in a year, Traoré appeared in his military fatigues, simple, practical, authentic. No fanfare, no ceremony. He walked directly to a wooden podium that looked like it had been borrowed from the local school. The executives shifted nervously. Everything about this felt wrong to them. Where was the power display they were accustomed to? Where were the golden chairs and national flags that signaled this was a meeting between their equals? Instead, they faced a 36-year-old soldier, standing before his people. And those people were watching the corporate delegation with curious, expectant eyes. What the executives didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In the modern history of Africa, for the first time in decades, an African leader was about to speak directly to his people while foreign corporations listened, rather than the other way around. "Gentlemen, ladies," Traoré began in French, his voice carrying perfectly without amplification. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I know you expected to meet in different circumstances, but I wanted you to speak to Burkina Faso, not just to me. These people around you, they are Burkina Faso." Anderson loosened his tie. The room felt warmer than expected, though perhaps it wasn't the temperature making him sweat. Traoré pulled out a single sheet of paper, and somehow that simple gesture commanded absolute attention. "I have here the combined profits your 14 companies extracted from Burkina Faso last year, 17 billion euros. I also have the amount you paid in taxes, 300 million euros. That's less than 2%. The silence was deafening. These were numbers the executives knew intimately, but hearing them spoken aloud in this setting, surrounded by the faces of people who lived on less than $2 a day, transformed abstract figures into something far more uncomfortable. "But numbers are just numbers," Traoré continued. "Let me tell you what they mean." And this is where the meeting transformed from a business discussion into something resembling a moral reckoning. Traoré gestured to an elderly woman in the front row, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "This is Mama Salamata. She worked in your gold mines for 30 years, Mr. Anderson. She earned 40 euros a month while extracting gold worth millions. Today, she cannot afford medicine for the arthritis caused by the conditions in your mines." Anderson wanted to protest, to explain about market rates and operational costs, to defend the jobs his company provided. But something in Traoré's eyes, not anger, not hatred, just calm certainty, made him remain silent. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was something else entirely, something he hadn't encountered in 4 decades of doing business. "Across Africa, Mr. Richter," Traoré continued, turning to the Titan Resources CEO, "your company has been drilling for oil in our northern regions for 15 years. You've extracted 4 billion barrels. Do you know how many households in those regions have electricity?" The question hung in the air. Richter felt his collar tightening. 7%. 7% have light while you pump billions of dollars of oil from beneath their feet. The room was completely still now. Even the young people with phones seemed to have forgotten they were recording, captivated by this unprecedented moment of truth-telling. Richter found his prepared arguments crumbling in his throat. Yes, his company extracted oil worth billions. Yes, the local communities remained in darkness. But that wasn't his responsibility, was it? His job was to generate returns for shareholders, not to electrify Africa. Yet surrounded by these faces, these real people whose lives his company's operations touched daily, such reasoning felt suddenly hollow. "Madame Moreau," Traoré's voice remained steady, almost gentle. "Your agricultural companies control 60% of our arable land. You grow cotton for European fashion houses while Burkinabe children suffer malnutrition. Last year, you exported cotton worth 2 billion euros. The farmers who grow it earned less than $1 a day." Moreau opened her mouth, then closed it. She had statistics ready, data about agricultural productivity and global market dynamics. But the elderly women in traditional dress were staring at her not with anger, but with a kind of patient waiting, as if they'd been waiting decades to hear what she might say in response. She found she had nothing. This was the genius of Traoré's approach. He wasn't attacking these executives personally. He wasn't questioning their character or their intentions. He was simply stating facts that everyone in the room, everyone in Burkina Faso, already knew. The unprecedented part was that someone in power was finally saying these truths out loud, in front of both the exploiters and the exploited. "Now," Traoré said, and his voice took on a different quality, still calm, but with an edge of steel that made every executive in the room lean forward involuntarily. "I could seize your assets. I could nationalize your operations. Many of my advisors have urged me to do exactly that. It would be legal under international law, given the unconscionable terms of your contracts." The relief in the room from the corporate side was almost palpable. This was familiar territory. Threats of nationalization were part of the standard playbook. There were always ways to negotiate, always compromises to be reached, always face-saving solutions that maintained the status quo while appearing to address concerns. But Traoré wasn't finished. "But I'm not going to do that." The relief was short-lived. "Instead, I'm going to give you a choice. You can stay in Burkina Faso, but under new terms. 51% local ownership. Minimum wage of 300 euros per month for all workers. 30% of profits reinvested in local infrastructure. Environmental restoration funds managed by local communities. Full transparency in all financial dealings, with records, public and accessible. He paused, looking at each executive in turn. Or you can leave. The silence that followed was unlike anything these corporate veterans had ever experienced. Finally, Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Meridian Extraction, found his voice, though it came out smaller than he'd intended. This is impossible. These terms would make our operations unprofitable. Our shareholders would never accept this. Traoré nodded, slowly, as if Pierce had just proved his point. I understand. Your shareholders' profits matter more than Burkinabe lives. That's been clear for decades. So leave. The simplicity was stunning. No anger, no drama, just a statement of fact delivered with the weight of absolute moral certainty. But you need us, stammered Wilhelm Krauss from Continental Mining Corporation, desperation creeping into his voice. Our technology, our expertise, our connections to global markets. Without us, your economy will collapse. And that's when Traoré smiled, the first time during the entire meeting. It wasn't a cruel smile or a triumphant one. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting his entire life for someone to make exactly that argument. Mr. Krauss, that's what you've told us for 60 years, that we need you more than you need us. But let me share something with you. Traoré pulled out his phone and connected it to a small projector. The image that appeared was a map of Africa with various points highlighted in bright colors. As of this morning, I have formal agreements with 7 African nations for technical cooperation. Our combined engineering graduates number over 1 million. We have partnerships with universities in China, India, Brazil, and Russia for technology transfer. We have investment funds from the Middle East ready to replace every euro you take. Out. The executives stared at the map, and for the first time, they began to understand that this wasn't an impulsive decision by a young hothead. This was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of careful preparation. But more importantly, Traoré continued, gesturing to the young people in the room, we have them. This generation that refuses to accept that Africa's role is to make others rich while remaining poor ourselves. David Lina, representing 3 Swedish telecommunications companies, tried a different approach. President Traoré, surely we can negotiate these terms you're proposing. They're just an opening position, right? Everything is negotiable. Traoré shook his head slowly. No, Mr. Lina, that's your way, not ours. Negotiation assumes both parties have something the other needs. But we don't need you. We have what you need, our resources, our land, our labor. You have nothing we cannot obtain elsewhere under fair terms. The fear in the room was now palpable among the executives. This wasn't following any playbook they knew. They had dealt with African leaders before, many of them. There was always an angle, always a deal to be made, always a way to maintain their advantages through a combination of economic pressure, political influence, and carefully placed bribes. But this young soldier wasn't playing their game. He wasn't even acknowledging their game existed. You have 72 hours to decide, Traoré announced, beginning to wrap up the meeting. Stay under our terms, or leave with what you can carry. Any assets left behind will be considered abandoned, and will revert to the Burkinabe people. This is theft, burst out Alessandro Romano, CEO of Apex Industries, his composure finally cracking completely. We have contracts, legal agreements signed in good faith. We'll go to international courts. We'll seek damages. The room tensed, waiting for Traoré's response to this direct challenge. But instead of anger, his face showed something almost like pity. Mr. Romano, those contracts were signed with governments that didn't represent their people. Contracts signed under coercion, corruption, and colonial pressure have no moral validity. As for international courts, he shrugged, go ahead. While you spend years in litigation, we'll be building our country with partners who respect us. But Traoré had one more thing to say, and it was perhaps the most important part of his entire speech. Before you leave, I want you to understand something. This isn't about hatred. We don't hate you. We don't even blame you personally for being part of a system that has exploited Africa for generations. This is about justice. This is about dignity. This is about our children having the same opportunities as your children. His voice remained calm, but there was an undercurrent of deep emotion now. For too long, Africa has been treated like a plantation, and you've been the overseers, perhaps not by choice, perhaps not with malicious intent, but overseers nonetheless. That era ends today, here in Burkina Faso. You can be part of Africa's future as partners, real partners, or you can be part of its past. The choice is yours. As the executives filed out of the community center, their faces pale and drawn, they passed through crowds that had gathered outside. Thousands of Burkinabe had come, not to protest, not to celebrate, but simply to witness history being made. They stood in silence, watching these powerful men and women walk to their luxury vehicles, their eyes reflecting not anger or triumph, but the quiet dignity of people who had finally heard someone speak their truth to power. Inside the cars, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Phones were ringing constantly. Emergency board meetings were being called across Europe. Stock prices were already beginning to fluctuate as news of the meeting leaked out, spread by those smartphones that had recorded every word. Henrik Anderson was on his third desperate call to Stockholm when his assistant showed him something on a tablet that made his blood run cold. It was a live stream from the meeting, already viewed 2 million times and climbing rapidly. The comments were flooding in from across Africa, across the world. Finally, this is what leadership looks like. Burkina Faso leads, others will follow. About time someone stood up to these corporations. This man is speaking for all of Africa. Anderson realized with a chill that this wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. If Traoré succeeded, if he actually forced them out or made them accept these terms, every African nation would want the same. The implications were staggering. 14 companies representing combined revenues of over 300 billion euros had 72 hours to make a decision that could reshape the economic landscape of an entire continent. Why that evening, the expatriate community in Ouagadougou was in complete chaos. The Cercle France, the exclusive club where European business executives had gathered for decades to network and coordinate their strategies, was packed with emergency meetings. Marcus Richter stood before a hastily assembled group, trying to project calm while his world crumbled around him. "We need to stand together," he declared, his voice betraying his desperation. "If we all refuse his terms, he'll have to back down." The economic shock would be too great for the country to handle. But Claudette Moreau, who had been unusually quiet since the meeting, shook her head slowly. "You didn't see his eyes, Marcus. You didn't see the faces of the people in that room. He's not bluffing. He'd rather see the economy crash and rebuild from scratch than continue under the current terms." "Then we fight," insisted Romano, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "We have contracts worth billions. We have international law on our side. We have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union. We have leverage they can't ignore." Jonathan Pierce laughed bitterly. "What leverage, Alessandro? Did you see the people in that room? They're ready for whatever comes next. They've been living on scraps for decades while we got rich off their labor. And those partnership agreements Traoré mentioned? I've already had calls from 3 Chinese companies and 2 Indian conglomerates ready to take over our operations. The moment we leave." The room erupted in desperate arguments. Some wanted to fight through international courts. Others pushed for behind-the-scenes diplomatic pressure. Still others were already secretly planning their withdrawal, hoping to salvage whatever they could before complete collapse. What none of them understood was that their era of easy exploitation was already over. The only question now was whether they would adapt or be replaced. Meanwhile, in a modest government office across the city, far from the luxury of the Cercle France, Traoré sat with his closest advisors. They were nervous but determined, fully aware of the magnitude of what they had just set in motion. "The markets will react badly," warned his finance minister, Patricia Ouedraogo, reviewing economic projections on her laptop. "Our currency could crash. International credit ratings will plummet. Foreign aid might be suspended. We could face economic isolation." Traoré nodded gravely. He had studied these projections for months before making his decision. "I know the risks, Patricia, but what's the alternative? Another 60 years of being Europe's gas station and gold mine? Another generation of our children watching foreign corporations extract billions while they can't afford school fees?" Colonel Amadou Sawadogu, his security advisor, had different concerns. "They'll try to destabilize us," he warned. fund opposition, groups, spread disinformation, maybe even attempt a coup. This threatens their entire African strategy. Traoré's response was calm but firm. Let them try. You saw the people today. You saw their faces. They're ready for this fight. They've been waiting their whole lives for someone to give them this chance. But privately, Traoré knew the next 72 hours would be the most critical in Burkina Faso's modern history. He had thrown down a gauntlet that challenged the entire post-colonial economic order in Africa. Now he had to see if his people, and the continent, were ready to pick it up. As the deadline ticked closer, the drama intensified exponentially. 3 companies, the most risk-averse and inflexible, immediately announced they would withdraw entirely, triggering panic selling of their stocks on European markets. Their shareholders, caught completely off guard, watched billions in market value evaporate overnight. 4 other companies tried desperately to negotiate, sending teams of high-priced lawyers and consultants to find some middle ground. But Traoré refused to meet with them. His message, delivered through intermediaries, was crystal clear. The terms are set. The choice is yours. This inflexibility infuriated corporate executives accustomed to finding creative solutions to political problems. But it also sent a powerful message across Africa and beyond. This wasn't a negotiating tactic or a publicity stunt. This was a fundamental redrawing of the relationship between Africa and its former colonizers. The French government, recognizing the broader implications, got directly involved. President Emmanuel Macron himself called Traoré a conversation that would later be leaked and analyzed by media across the globe. You're making a serious mistake, Macron reportedly warned. France has been Burkina Faso's partner for decades. We've provided aid, investment, security cooperation. This confrontational approach will only hurt your people. Traoré's response, according to the leaked transcript, was polite but devastating. Mr. President, we're looking for partners, not masters. If France wants to work with us as equals, you're welcome. If you want to continue the old relationship where you take our resources and give us aid scraps in return, then we respectfully decline. But something unexpected was happening across Africa. Instead of the international isolation that the European executives expected, other African nations began to speak up in support of Burkina Faso's bold stand. Mali announced it was launching a comprehensive review of all foreign mining contracts. Niger suspended 3 uranium extraction licenses pending renegotiation of terms. Ghana began an audit of foreign-owned agricultural operations. The Democratic Republic of Congo called for a continental conference on resource extraction that on social media, #BurkinaStandsUp, became a global trending topic, shared millions of times in dozens of languages. Videos of Traoré's speech, subtitled in everything from Swahili to Portuguese, went viral across the African diaspora. Young Africans from Lagos to Nairobi shared stories of exploitation by foreign corporations, creating a continent-wide conversation about economic sovereignty that had been brewing for decades. International economists were divided. Some called it economic suicide, predicting that Burkina Faso would become a failed state within months. Others hailed it as long overdue decolonization, arguing that the extractive economic model had never truly benefited ordinary Africans anyway. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source: African investors and entrepreneurs who had been operating in the shadow of European corporations for decades. Suddenly, they saw opportunities that had been locked away behind walls of foreign control. With just hours remaining before the deadline, the first crack in European solidarity appeared. Surprisingly, it came from Wilhelm Krauss of Continental Mining Corporation. In a private meeting with his board of directors in Hamburg, Krauss had spent hours running numbers and analyzing scenarios. Listen, he told his skeptical colleagues, we can accept these terms and still be profitable. Less profitable than before, yes, but profitable nonetheless. And if we're the first to agree, we'll have a significant advantage when other countries inevitably follow this model. His board was deeply skeptical. Accepting Traoré's terms would set a precedent that could spread across their African operations. But Krauss had done the math carefully. Even with 51% local ownership, higher wages, and profit-sharing requirements, Continental Mining could still generate hundreds of millions in annual profits from its Burkina Faso operations. More importantly, being first to accept would position them as progressive partners in Africa's development rather than neocolonial exploiters. It could open doors across the continent as other nations looked for companies willing to work under fair terms. "We're not charity workers," Kraus told his board. "We're businessmen, and I can see which way the wind is blowing. This is the future of doing business in Africa. We can be ahead of the curve or behind it." At hour 68 of the 72-hour deadline, Continental Mining made a stunning announcement. They would accept President Traoré's terms in full. The shock among the European business community was profound and immediate. Alessandro Romano, who had been coordinating resistance efforts, called Kraus in a rage. "You're betraying everything we've built here," he shouted over a crackling international connection. "You're legitimizing this madness." But Kraus was unmoved. "I'm a businessman, Alessandro. I see an opportunity while you see only threats. In 5 years, when half of Africa has adopted similar policies, Continental Mining will already be established as the partner of choice for the new Africa." The domino effect was immediate and dramatic. Within 6 hours of Continental Mining's announcement, 2 more companies, both smaller players who had been wavering, announced they would also stay under the new terms. This created panic among the remaining companies. If some of their competitors were going to remain in Burkina Faso under the new arrangement, those who left would lose their market position entirely. But for most of them, pride, shareholder pressure, and an inability to imagine a different way of doing business in Africa led to only one choice: by the 72-hour deadline. 11 of the 14 companies had announced their withdrawal from Burkina Faso. The headlines across international media were dramatic and conflicted. European exodus from Burkina Faso, Traoré's gamble, economic liberation or suicide. The 7-minute speech that shook Africa, end of an era. Corporate colonialism under threat. The departing executives held a defiant press conference at Ouagadougou's international airport, trying to control the narrative even as their world collapsed around them. "This is a dark day for Burkina Faso," Henrik Anderson declared, standing before a battery of cameras and microphones. "They've chosen ideology over prosperity, politics over pragmatism. Without foreign investment and expertise, this country will slide backward into poverty and isolation." But even as he spoke, Anderson's phone was buzzing with furious messages from shareholders demanding answers about abandoned assets and lost profits. The stock price of Nord Gold Mining had fallen 30% in 3 days, wiping out billions in market value. Behind the public bravado, these corporate titans were privately terrified. They had built their African strategies on the assumption that they were irreplaceable, that African nations needed them more than they needed Africa. Traoré had just proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. The 3 companies that chose to stay, Continental Mining, Meridian Extraction, and somewhat surprisingly, a mid-sized French agricultural firm called Agrovert, found themselves in an unprecedented position. Jonathan Pierce of Meridian Extraction, who had initially resisted but finally accepted the terms, told his board in a confidential call that would later be leaked. "We're now the senior Western partners in what might become Africa's most important economic experiment. If this works, and I'm beginning to think it might, we'll be positioned perfectly for the new Africa that's emerging." Agrovert's CEO, Marie Dubois, had made perhaps the most calculated decision of all. Her company specialized in sustainable agriculture and had been looking for ways to differentiate itself from larger competitors. Partnering with local farmers under equitable terms aligned perfectly with both their business model and their values. But the real winners were the Burkinabe people themselves. Within weeks of the European exodus, applications flooded in from companies across Asia, the Middle East, and other African nations eager to work under the new terms. Many of these potential partners brought not just investment capital, but genuine technology transfer and skills development programs. The immediate aftermath was indeed chaotic, just as the pessimists had predicted. The Burkinabe franc lost 20% of its value in the first week. International credit agencies downgraded the country's rating. Some foreign aid was suspended. Western media painted a picture of economic collapse and administrative chaos. But something extraordinary began to happen beneath the surface chaos. Remittances from the Burkinabe diaspora, citizens working in Europe, North America, and other African countries, increased by 300% in the first month. It was as if Burkinabe living abroad were responding to their country's declaration of dignity by sending home every spare euro they could find. Several Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, impressed by Traoré's principled stand, announced major infrastructure investments. A consortium of Indian technology companies proposed a comprehensive digital transformation initiative that would leapfrog Burkina Faso ahead of many developed nations in terms of digital infrastructure. Most surprisingly, applications to Burkina Faso's universities from across Africa increased by 500%. Young people from across the continent wanted to study in the country that had finally stood up to neocolonial exploitation. But perhaps the most significant change wasn't in Burkina Faso at all. It was in boardrooms across Europe, Asia, and North America, where executives dealing with African operations suddenly had a new calculation to make. The era of easy exploitation was ending, not just in Burkina Faso, but potentially across the continent. If Traoré's model succeeded, if he could prove that fair partnerships were more sustainable than extractive relationships, other African leaders would inevitably follow suit. Corporate strategists began conducting urgent reviews of their African operations. Which contracts were most vulnerable to the Ouagadougou treatment? Which African leaders might be inspired to make similar demands? How could they proactively restructure their operations to avoid sudden ejection from lucrative markets? Meanwhile, African leaders were watching Burkina Faso's experiment with intense interest. Some were inspired by Traoré's courage. Others were terrified by the potential economic disruption. But all of them were learning important lessons about the changing dynamics of power in the 21st century. 12 months after that historic 7-minute speech, international economists began using a new term: the Ouagadougou precedent. 5. African nations had implemented similar policies, forcing foreign corporations to accept local partnerships or face expulsion. The predicted economic collapse in Burkina Faso had not materialized. After an initial period of contraction, the economy was growing again, but under fundamentally different terms. Unemployment, which had spiked immediately after the European exodus, was falling as local companies took over abandoned operations and new partnerships brought fresh investment. More importantly, there was a sense of possibility in the country that hadn't existed for generations. Young Burkinabe who might have once dreamed of escaping to Europe were now starting businesses, pursuing education, and building careers in their homeland. In a comprehensive interview with Al Jazeera, Traoré reflected on those pivotal 7 minutes. "I didn't plan to change everything with that speech. I simply told the truth about exploitation, about dignity, about our right to determine our own future. It turns out that's all our people needed to hear." The 14 European companies that had once dominated Burkina Faso's economy were reduced to 3, operating under terms that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. But perhaps more significantly, the remaining companies were reporting something remarkable to their shareholders. When people felt they were partners rather than servants, everything improved. Employee productivity increased dramatically. Theft and sabotage, once chronic problems, virtually disappeared. Local communities began protecting company infrastructure as their own. The final vindication of Traoré's approach came from the most unlikely source imaginable. 6 months after fleeing Burkina Faso in apparent defeat, Henrik Andersson was caught in a hidden camera investigation by Swedish journalists in what he thought was a private dinner conversation. Andersson was recorded saying words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "You know what? Traoré was right. We were parasites. For 40 years, we took everything and gave nothing meaningful back. The wages we paid were insulting. The environmental damage we caused was criminal. Maybe it's better this way." The video went viral across Africa, viewed tens of millions of times and shared with the commentary, "Even they know we were right." Andersson was forced to resign in disgrace, but his admission became an unexpected vindication of everything Traoré had argued. Here was one of Europe's most prominent African business leaders admitting that the old system had indeed been exploitative and unsustainable. Today, the community center where those historic 7 minutes were spoken has become an unlikely pilgrimage site. Young entrepreneurs from across Africa come to stand where Traoré stood, drawing inspiration for their own challenges. Students sit where the European CEOs sat, trying to imagine the fear and confusion of people who thought they were masters of the universe suddenly discovering they were not. And sometimes, late in the evening when the crowds have gone home, Mama Salamata comes by, the elderly woman Traoré had pointed to during his speech. She tells anyone who will listen, "I worked 30 years for them and got nothing but pain and arthritis. That day, my president spoke for 7 minutes and gave me back my dignity. That's worth more than all the gold they ever took from our soil." The transformation of Burkina Faso continues to inspire and terrify in equal measure. For young Africans, dreaming of a continent that works for its own people, it represents hope and possibility. For multinational corporations accustomed to extracting resources on colonial terms, it represents an existential threat to business models built on exploitation. But perhaps the most important lesson of those 7 minutes is the simplest one. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a leader can do is simply tell the truth. Not with anger or hatred, but with the calm dignity that comes from knowing you're fighting for something larger than yourself. 7 minutes. That's all it took to end an era and begin another. 7 minutes of truth spoken calmly in a modest room, witnessed by ordinary people who had waited generations to hear someone say what Ibrahim Traoré said that day. The world is still watching to see what comes next.